Much like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy XIII opens strong by throwing the player straight into the action. It doesn't do as well at immediately making it clear what's going on, but with two colourful characters doing battle with some kind of oppressive military threat, within the first few minutes of play, it's easy to get caught up in all the excitement.
Run! I've been away!
The biggest mistake of the first few hours is the game introducing the auto battle function too early. Before the combat opens up, in these early levels you basically have three major moves. You can choose when to do an attack that hits a single enemy, when to do an attack that takes longer to charge but can hit multiple, and when to heal. Hit auto battle though, and the game will quite reliably ascertain which of those two attacks is best at that moment. Once paradigms get introduced in Chapter 3, auto battle starts to make more sense as a feature, since the focus of the combat becomes switching the roles of your characters quickly on the fly. This becomes the biggest decision to make in battle, and is largely more important than discerning which specific attacks in those roles will be most effective. But in the early hours before role switching is available, just having to make that choice between the two attacks yourself would have been considerably more engaging. Once those 2 hours are up, the system gets a lot more interesting, but it still requires some proactive effort on the player's part to get the most out of it. The faster you finish a fight, the higher your chance of getting rewards from defeated enemies. Fighting fast also helps refill the technique point gauge quickly, which you can expend to use special skills that will in turn make the next fight faster. Staggering enemies is the key to making a fight go quicker. Stagger an enemy and you can deal massive damage for a short time. A character can be set to be a commando, to perform high damage attacks, or set to be a ravager, which will have them outputting less powerful moves, but with elemental attributes that can sometimes make up the difference, depending on the foe. Ravager attacks also raise your damage multiplier faster. To successfully raise an enemy's stagger meter though and knock them out for a bit, you'll want to hit them with attacks from both of these roles. Ravager attacks raise the stun meter quickly in large chunks, while commando attacks keep the meter from falling when your magic is recharging. Have two Ravagers in play alongside a commando, and you can raise the stun gauge and attack multiplier even faster. In the early hours of the game, you'll generally only have two party members though, so usually to raise a stagger meter, you'll want them assigned to Commando and Ravager respectively, but this will leave you without an assigned medic, another role you can assign to a character. So to get the most out of the combat, you want to play proactively, switching roles on the fly to deal stagger damage while knowing when to change it up to play defense and heal. Auto battle queues up multiple moves for you, but sometimes waiting for a queue of moves isn't always the best option if you want to quickly prevent an enemy stagger bar from resetting, or if you want to interrupt them by quickly performing one single move. So sometimes foregoing waiting for the auto battle for a quick single attack of your choice can be advantageous. Later in the game too, as situations become more complex or niche, auto battle might give you a more inefficient string of attacks for the moment than you could have picked manually. There's a problem early on though, especially with the two party member fights. The problem is that if you set up one party member to attack and the other to be a medic, even if you don't stagger enemies because you lack that Commando Ravager combo, it's still possible to mash auto battle and grind through a lot of these early fights slowly, by having a healer constantly present while you chip away at the enemy. Early battles with three party members are also still too easy, where you can comfortably set up a Commando Ravager and medic and kick back. In essence, playing like this early on does allow a player to mash X to win, just while sucking out all the fun of the game and turning it into a grind. This won't work for every fight, even near the start, and there comes a point where this strategy will become unviable, even for the most patient of players, later on when enemies become more aggressive with bigger health bars. But I think it would have served the game much better if it had been made harder in that first third. Make it so grinding out a fight isn't possible and players are forced to engage. While the thought process might have been to make things more laid back, to give players the opportunity to experiment early on, I wonder if it's more likely to encourage lazy playing, and accidentally frame the game as a slog to novices not keen on leaving the comfort zone of having a medic permanently in play. For a game that will respawn you right before your most recent fights if you lose with full health, it feels like the battles themselves could have been harsher. However, no matter how much you're willing to engage, the chapters with only 2 members in the party do start to drag on way too long regardless, subjecting you to the same environments and the same enemies for longer than their novelty really permits. Pretty much every chapter in this game is about a third longer than it needs to be, but the prize for the biggest pace breaker has to go to Chapter 4. Chapters 1 and 2 are about an hour each, and Chapter 3 is 2 hours, so when Chapter 4 clocks in at a massive 4 hours of bumming around a junkyard, it can feel like the game is grinding to a halt. Not to say the early chapters don't try and throw in the odd gimmick to keep things fresh, such as Chapter 4's enemies that fight each other, which asks of the player to decide who should be targeted first. Chapter 6 throws out some optional tougher enemies, and the simple unlocking of more roles for your characters to take on is also a novelty in the early game. But I think it's impossible to play FF13 without feeling at some point, every chapter, like you've had enough of wherever you are. It's hard not to be in awe at the look of most of these early levels though. Outside of the junkyard, they're vibrant and clean, yet no less detailed, twisting around in unearthly ways. The floating world of Cocoon is both inviting and alien, daunting yet alluring, which given that it's an ostensible paradise for humans with sinister forces pulling the strings, is very appropriate. In the first half of the game, you won't be doing much exploring in these places though. It's a lot of straight lines with a few items on the side. When there are no real movement or traversal mechanics to speak of, I'm not terribly bothered by how open a game's levels are, nor do I think games with RPG mechanics inherently need to have non-linear worlds. That said, it would have been nice to have some side activities to try on the way, and maybe go back to later in the game, when it gives you the option to explore older areas again. At one point, the characters decide to go to a giant fairground with the explicit goal of chilling out for a bit.
But should we really be playing around?
Forget about that heavy stuff for a while.
So having no actual minigames to try is only setting players up for disappointment. Weird, barren theme park detour aside, the lack of distractions in the first half do help the gameplay match up with what's happening in the story, more so than most RPGs ever manage, as the characters are frantically trying to escape Cocoon's armed forces.
Gotta go!
In a lot of RPGs, the story implies time is of the essence, while characters are allowed to mess around on side quests endlessly. But like I said, I wouldn't scoff at some kind of optional triple triad side game along the way in the first half for the sake of that synergy. I can suspend my disbelief, believe it or not, in games where confronting an enemy results in digital theater curtains closing to redecorate for a set better fitting a battle. It's notable, however, how far FF13 goes to tear down those curtains. Sometimes the game does these amazing seamless transitions from cutscene to gameplay, transferring the energy of said cutscene into the play. Even when the game can't make the transition seamless, a lot of times there's at least an attempt to try and line up the cutscene somewhat with the stage you'll be fighting in. The characters in this game get put through hell, and the way they can pick themselves up and muster the energy to summon those battle menus onto the screen is inspiring. Makes you wish you could summon your own action menus in real life when in a tough spot. It's worth underlining just how decadent of a game FF13 is. From carefully curated transitions like these, to the lavish environments, to the extreme detail of the action cutscenes where every frame is like a fully realized painting, the game is unapologetically indulgent. Calling one of the best parts of a game its amazing cinemas always raises some eyebrows. But honestly, where else are you even going to get to see action in animation of this budget and quality that's not for children? It's rarely going to happen anywhere else but in games. Outside of the last couple of films Square Enix made themselves, at least. Either way, skip the cutscenes and tutorials and you're playing a very gamey game with FF13. But a good chunk of the work takes place outside of combat. In addition to Ravager, Commando, and Medic, there are another 3 assignable roles. Synergist for buffing the party, Saboteur for debuffing the enemies, and Sentinel, which draws attention away from other party members and helps protect them. You can have 3 party members max in a battle, but you can switch mid-fight between 6 different role presets called paradigms, which can be customized between fights. So you want to create a dynamic mix of roles throughout your 6 paradigm slots, and then in battle, pay keen attention to switch when needed. Maybe you load up a paradigm with 2 attackers, and the third member protects by being a medic or sentinel. Maybe you make a backup emergency paradigm with a sentinel and a medic, or one where you can focus on buffs and debuffs, while always having a fully offensive paradigm on hand for when you just want to go in on the enemy. 6 available formations being available mid-combat is pretty much the perfect amount, as you get plenty of options, but not enough to where you can just have a whole Rolodex of slight alterations. You have to plan ahead and make smart use of the available slots on offer. Something that is a pain though and discourages experimentation is how if you change members of your party, you'll have to remake your whole paradigm list again, which is unavoidable when for most of the game not every character will have access to every role, but a way to store your favorite paradigms by team would have been a nice feature. By the time all the game's gameplay elements open up, entering a fight unprepared without a clear series of possible strategies in mind to deploy will swiftly result in a game over, perhaps an indication of why the devs were overly hesitant to roll the game's mechanics out quickly. One question to ask is, what if there was no auto battle and you had to pick each individual move instead of the game typically picking what it thinks will help the most in a given circumstance, such as auto battle for Ravagers, picking elemental weaknesses for enemies if you've scanned them for data or whittled down the alternatives, or auto battle for Synergists, largely picking defensive buffs before offensive ones. Well, as the battles are paced now, it would make things much harder, and not so much in a tactical sense, but a reflex sense, as the extra seconds it takes to select specific moves would spell disaster in a lot of encounters with enemies closing in fast. However, you can actually change the speed of the battles to accommodate for if you want to enter every move manually, by switching battle speed to slow in the menu. If you want to pretend auto battle doesn't exist, you can even set the cursor to automatically return to move selection rather than the auto battle function. Playing FF13 like this, with slow battles turned on, and your cursor set to ignore auto battle, gives you an idea of what the game would have been like if it had been balanced around auto battle not existing. And it goes without saying that playing this way requires more input while slowing the game down a lot. Here's the thing, in an RPG where most moves don't have any resource cost associated with them, I don't think it would be all that interesting to force the player to hover over to, say, the fire magic over and over every time you're trying to attack an enemy weak to fire. Auto battle allows the game to be played at dynamic, fast speeds while focusing on the elements of this battle system that require the most choice, which are the paradigm shifts. One element of play I want to put under some scrutiny that goes largely unexamined in games like this is the preemptive strike. When walking freely outside of battle, if you make contact with an enemy before they see you, you'll begin the battle with a big advantage, putting all enemies on the screen close to a staggered state right at the beginning. This can cut down a fight's time tremendously, and basically ends a lot of encounters that would have been a big effort before they even begin, netting you a big technique point payout at the end. But what type of skill do you have to prove yourself good at to get this edge? Well, expendable items exist that can blind enemies to your presence, serving as a get-out-of-jail-free card you can ration and play at tough moments. That's fine for what it is. Otherwise, it's about jankily sliding up to the enemy without being spotted, and I sort of have to question how much combat, the core mechanical arena of this title, is ultimately affected by playing what is essentially a terrible bare-bones stealth game. Even more nonsensical is that you can basically endlessly retry your luck on catching an enemy off guard, since retrying a fight will put you back before they detected you. So the power is always there for you to try again and maximize your chances in the fight. Well, it sort of is. It is and it isn't. The game tries to discourage abusing reloads by creating enemy placements that make preemptive striking without an item seemingly impossible, or at least such a big effort to finagle that repeatedly trying isn't worth the time investment. But a better way to discourage exploiting backstabs would have just been to only make them possible on a first attempt, and to make them unattainable after a retry. In a truly skill-based game where only mastery of the core mechanics can elicit the best victory, the preemptive strike system wouldn't exist. But let's look at the positives. It gives the out-of-combat environments more reason to exist beyond being a list of fights, with items hidden behind corners. Even if in the most abstract way possible, it helps suggest the characters really are making their way through a world, running into enemies and being forced to outmaneuver them smartly. Maybe that makes it worth it in your mind. It's undeniable the levels would lose a little something without more than one way to interact with enemies in them, but I can think of some other systems that could have been more skill-based and more directly tied to skill within combat. Say your score in combat averaged out to a stat that, if high, could start a subsequent fight with enemy stun meters already elevated. Maybe this preemptive strike stat could act as a kind of expendable resource. Like if you had filled up the quote-unquote preemptive strike meter from a high score in a previous battle, you could choose to blast or not blast an enemy before a fight with it, and how high up the saved up number is would determine how high enemy stun gauges would fill at the start of combat. In this scenario, enemies being present, wandering throughout the levels, at least would matter in the sense that you could pick who to spend your preemptive strike juice on. Maybe on a tougher looking enemy, or maybe on an enemy guarding an item perhaps. A system like this is semi-present in the game, thanks to the Quake ability. It expends TP to hit all enemies on screen for a bit of damage. If you do this immediately after getting a preemptive strike, it will basically stun all on-screen enemies. So juice earned from a good battle performance can be exchanged for a leg up in battle. It's just buried one layer below the far less earned preemptive strike. Fights in the game are lent energy not just mechanically with their demanding fast pace and how quickly you can end up wiped out, but through how it's all presented.
That's you. Done.
All the party members bring a colourful energy to the table that complement one another as they bop around the arena shouting out encouragement.
Keep up with me, Hope.
Lightning and Fang are the no-nonsense warriors, dispatching foes with a conspicuous efficiency, but stylishly. One the soldier of the future, and one the soldier of the past. Snow has a boundless enthusiasm.
Fun times.
Always pumping his fists as if to reload them before charging in, never deterred.
We gotta win this!
Vanille is the force of nature that doesn't let the fight knock her out of her upbeat pep.
Change is good, Pops.
Hope is visibly frail, but inspires by not letting that stop him from gritting his teeth and fighting.
We can win this.
But with all that said, few things in life bring me as much joy as Zaz's battle animations. This middle-aged man, seemingly untrained in combat, throwing down with these visibly makeshift kung fu gunplay combos. It's somehow endearing and yet cool at the same time.
Almost feel sorry for you.
All of this is brought together under one of the greatest main battle themes there's been, Blinded by Light. The theme starts tense. Battle horns sound. Things have taken a turn for the dire. The build-up is spelling out the words, call an ambulance. And then the violin screams alive as if to say, but not for me. Bass notes growl onto the violin like those of an animal, reminding would-be predators that we're still kicking over here and we're not backing down. You'd hope it would be this good because you'll be hearing it a lot. The soundtrack in general is grand. With a perfect ebb and sway between tense and moments of catharsis and release. In certain areas, the music goes more angelic and dreamlike to really emphasize a world that's nothing like our own. And I suppose angelic in the sense that we're in the sky, above a figurative hell. Combine that ethereal mood with a sleek sci-fi world, where online shopping is the de facto way to buy anything, and you get that intense digital afterlife aesthetic. One aspect of the presentation the game doesn't skimp on either are the menus. Crystal has been a defining motif of the Final Fantasy series for a long time, so it's only natural for the UI to follow suit with a crystal clean aesthetic. The cross-fading animations of each character's FMV face in the status screen is one of the most stylish little touches I've ever seen, like you're tapping the character on the shoulder to see their stats. Aesthetically, the menus are great, but I'd be remiss to not bring up how functionally they fall short in one major area: the save points. At various terminals located across the world, you can save your game, access a shop, or upgrade your items. Unfortunately, if you exit the shop, for example, the game won't return you to the menu where you can select from these three options. Instead, it will back you out of the terminal entirely. So if, say, you want to go from the shop to the item upgrade screen, which you'll be doing a lot, you'll be backed all the way out and then have to wait around for the prompt to go back in to appear again. It's only a small delay, but over the course of the game, it adds up. It becomes a massive inconvenience and makes weapon upgrading far more tedious than it should be. Said weapon and item upgrade system isn't very complex, but it has a little more going on than just finding a list of materials for a specific upgrade. Here there are two types of upgrade materials, natural and synthetic. Applying natural materials will up an XP multiplier that will offer huge bonuses if applied to an item before then sticking synthetic materials on top. This equation isn't hard to get right, but it's possible to overdo it and inject too much XP into an item and lose excess points when the item hits a level cap. So it's about trying to gauge where to drop your biggest load without wasting those excess points. You can also deconstruct items into materials or sell them to buy materials in the shop. I'll be honest, a lot of the hidden minutiae of all this seems designed to sell strategy guides, but even if you're unable to be entirely efficient with your XP points, what's great here is the amount of options on the table. Each character has different weapons that can be upgraded that all favor different attributes. Accessories that grant additional stats or special effects can also be jacked up. With finite materials come interesting choices in how you want to deck out your characters. It can be fun to hypercharge some aspect of a character through upgrading different accessories or certain types of weapons. The other side of the character development coin is the Crystarium, where you can unlock permanent stat upgrades and new moves. Every character will eventually have access to 6 upgrade trees for all 6 roles in the game, which is 36 trees you can invest XP into. A few branching paths along the way allow some choice, but the biggest choice is just which of these 36 trees you want to invest in. Each character is usually more predisposed to 3 of the 6 roles. Those 3 trees they're predisposed towards will upgrade faster, offer more bonuses, and have moves and abilities not on other characters' equivalent role tree. Each party member has their strengths and weaknesses, but all of them can be brute forced into any role. So for example, in this playthrough I forced Saz into having a medic role, even though it's not a role he's predisposed towards, just to get to have him on the team and keep the overall squad balanced. You can create whatever team you want, but it will come at a cost. That cost, though, allowing each character to retain individuality and become more than just skins you apply to any battle role you want to with ease. Each character also gets to unlock their own specific summon that can be activated if they're party leader.
Alexander! Help, big guy!
Let's go!
Show 'em how it's done!
A good excuse to switch the party leader out to get the most out of each one. The summons are awesome. In exchange for your technique points, earned by performing well in fights, you can take a breather by letting your character's assigned monster from beyond rain hell upon your enemies. The fights where you have to prove your worth to them to unlock their services are pretty simple, but are given an awesome energy with an electric guitar ticking down the seconds you have left to prove you want to keep fighting through this journey.
You're gonna swerve!
One thing I was a little torn on when it comes to the Crystarium is how different tiers of it are gated by story progression. How far you can develop your character is often capped until you beat the next major boss, and while there's some wriggle room for improving your characters with the weapon/accessory upgrade system, how far you can develop is basically gated every big chunk of the game. On the one hand, this means the developers can balance the next major fight with a cap in mind, and make it so even if you theoretically maxed out your Crystarium up to that point, there's still some level of effort or strategy required on the part of the player to win. They can't just brute force it by painfully grinding out fights and over-leveling, at least when it comes to the bottleneck bosses. As discussed, the game fumbles the ball a bit on the player needing to apply that strategy against a lot of the early regular encounters, with their low difficulty, but oh well. On the flip side, restricting leveling up eliminates the fun of having to gauge how much you need to develop your character before you're comfortably able to beat the next roadblock boss that having complete control over the leveling up process comes with. In fairness, at least a player gets a taste of both styles. Once you get to the open world in Chapter 11, the Crystarium expands so far that there is a big chasm between the bare minimum level required to beat the next boss and a maxed out Crystarium. Toss in that in earlier levels with stricter Crystariums, you can still upgrade weapons a little bit too, giving you a bit of added freedom, and I'm honestly prepared to call this overall good design. Early on, the game puts a bigger focus on the player getting to terms with strategy than it does on how high they can get their stats. You can't grind out the second room for a week to max out all your characters and breeze through the game. But if you ask me, the game doesn't lose a whole lot by not letting you do that. So stat stacking is a little limited early in the game, but boy do they stack drama right from the start. FF13 is a relentless onslaught of emotional outbursts and characters teetering on the edge as they try to grapple with their situation. Our protagonists start out often abrasive and flawed, but they're nuanced, and that nuance is brought out by the impossible situation they're put in. Lightning and Snow are both trying to rescue Sarah, their sister and fiancé respectively, which has come at a bad time given their current family dynamic.
You're gonna marry this idiot? Get out of my house.
She's being exiled by the military of the floating orb world of Cocoon to the monster-ridden lower world of Pulse, alongside an entire town and a godlike being from said lower world, a Foul Sea, after it made her a Lussie, a magical warrior who must carry out that god's will.
That's a Pulse brand. That girl's a Lassie.
That will is passed onto the Lassie in the form of a vision called a focus. Caught in the crossfire is Hope, a nervous young boy being exiled with the town, and Saz, who has snuck along for the ride in the hopes that confronting this god will help his son Daj, another magical chosen one, but for the opposing godlike Foul Sea aligned with Cocoon.
When a person gets cursed by a Foul Sea, they become a Lassie. And they get given a focus, right?
Basically, Cocoon and Pulse both have their gods that pick humans to do their dirty work. These characters are great. They all give you reasons to empathize with them, and they have likable qualities, but they also have rough sides that can push each other away, and even make the player second guess where they stand with them. Lightning is a badass. Her forthright attitude and no-nonsense drive is inspiring in the face of adversaries so far beyond our comprehension, but she's prickly in a way that trips her up on occasion and of course puts her at odds with others.
Keep Sarah safe. That's my promise.
Great job so far.
Being that she had to raise her sister on her own though, her having this attitude is justified. Flawed in reasonable ways. It would take an exceptionally understanding person to not get mad and instead immediately try to verify that her sister and their boyfriend they don't like are telling the truth about said sister becoming a mythical magical warrior said to have only existed hundreds of years ago. She's so angry she lets that window slip by a few minutes. Frustrating but believable. Snow is the opposite, gentle and chill, rather than jagged and sudden.
Keep him safe.
I like Snow a lot. He's actually a pretty realistic depiction of how this type of terminally positive yet assertive and impulsive bloke can polarize the people around him, and isn't necessarily beloved or tolerated by all.
He's arrogant and chummy from the get-go. He thinks he's everybody's pal. Never liked him much.
Yeah, this kind of person can attract a lot of people, with their positive energy and good looks definitely helping.
When's the wedding, lover boy?
Well, don't worry, none of you are invited.
We're still going.
But equally, that energy can repel more pragmatic people away, or alienate others when your carefree attitude leads to saying something insensitive.
You think it's stupid to fight?
It is if you get killed.
Still, I'd be remiss not to note that I am absolutely a Snowvilliers guy. Sincerity and positivity is almost more admirable in the face of people not taking to it immediately, and the way his attitude is framed ultimately is a good thing, despite how it can lead him to naive, incorrect conclusions.
Our focus is... Are we supposed to...
Save her.
Say what?
Our focus is to protect Cocoon.
Paints him as both aspirational but still relatable. Saz is an extremely cool character.
Not so tough now, huh? Hey, that wasn't like a challenge now, all right?
He's a single father who gets on the train to hell with nothing but 2 guns, not because he's some tremendous badass, but because he feels it's the only option he has to help his son. Him jumping into the fray regardless makes him even more likable. But one interesting moment of nuance comes early on, when he suggests that maybe Lightning's sister is better off dead.
Post-Lassie are the enemies of Cocoon.
So they should die?
Listen, if she fails her focus, you know how that'll end.
And killing her is a mercy?
Once you become a Lassie bound to complete the task that a fal'Cie has dropped on you, you either complete your task, your focus, and get preserved in crystal eternally, or fail and become a mindless zombie creature.
She'll live her life as a fal'Cie slave. Don't make her suffer.
His suggestion to mercy kill Sarah comes off contradictory though, when considering his own precious son is also a Lassie. A lapse in thinking perhaps, or maybe something darker. If his son's task opposes that of Sarah's, then her demise could prevent his only child's zombification. An outcome one would assume he wants to prevent at all costs, even if the alternative of dormant preservation in a crystal isn't great either.
If she fails her focus, you know how that'll end.
A dark, vile bit of manipulation perhaps, but also realistic. Someone ready to risk it all by jumping on a deportation train to confront an ethereal being might perhaps also be ready to go to other extremes, or at least consider them for a moment in this case. Hope is a kid who loses his mom when Snow inspires her to fight back against the authorities banishing them. He holds a grudge against Snow for this and with nothing to lose aims to confront him. Distaste for Snow's recklessness giving him more in common with Lightning. This grieving kid is depicted as one would be, spiraling, and he's another ingredient in a volatile mix. When the characters catch up with Sarah, she turns to Crystal, her unknown mission complete. The gang try to batter the post-fal'Cie god responsible, but end up turned into Lassie themselves by it, with a vision of the destruction of Cocoon, suggesting their task is to destroy their home. Since our characters are Lassie now, this is where the Crystarium becomes available, and it's cool in a way that the esoteric concept of a character upgrade screen is given some in-game reason for existing. Like, not everyone in this universe can just get out of bed and unlock plus 20 HP or whatever. Though Vanille only pretends to have become a Lassie when the other 4 do. The others don't notice her brand is slightly different. So she was one during the first 2 chapters. I guess she was hiding her upgrade screen at that time as part of the ruse. I don't judge her for doing that though. I do the same when I'm just getting to know people. There are games with ragtag misfit groups of protagonists, but this team takes it to a dangerous new level. 2 of them have a pre-existing family conflict that now has evolved beyond the domestic into the apocalyptic. One of them is about to lose their son, and the other has just lost their mother. They already have pressing issues to contend with, and on top of that, they have a no-win scenario quest from the heavens imposed on them, as well as the nation's armies on the hunt tracking them down. Since, like Sarah, as post-Lassie, they are considered enemies of Cocoon. None of these people are in any shape to come together and form a team at all, and for a good chunk of the game, they don't. Instead, circumstance splits them off into pairs for most of the first half of the game. It does force the title into these 2 party member chapters for a lot of the early game, but it gives us a good chance to learn about the characters without them getting lost in the cacophony of a big group, as they bounce one-on-one off one of the other starkly different protagonists.
It's people like you that started the Purge in the first place.
Some pairings are more compelling than others, but once they all inevitably triumphantly reunite to form this Final Fantasy's team, you end up with these core rapports that crisscross between single members nicely. The other 2 teammates are Vanille and Fang, post-Lassie who carried out their focus centuries ago when there were people still left on Pulse. Said focus was also to harm Cocoon in some way. They were the ones responsible for the big chunk missing in it, but they've been reawakened generations later to presumably keep wailing on Cocoon some more.
Cocoon's version of the War of Transgression must have been built up around what you 2 did.
These 2 are the least interesting individually for me, but they basically serve as 2 broad archetypes that fill in for the now long gone population of Pulse, the warrior and the citizen. They're devoted to each other, and as they're essentially the last 2 members of their civilization, those 2 hearts still here, still beating like that for each other, beat even louder. A warning to the civilization of Cocoon, plagued by distrust and infighting, ready to go along with entire towns being purged, if a l'Cie might happen to be in their midst.
Hostages? They should just blow them away with the l'Cie.
There's something for our Cocoon denizens to aspire to as they resolve their issues, of which there are many. Inspiration is what makes this core group work so well together. They all feed off each other when someone in the group has something the others lack.
Always the hero. You wanna die? You can't. I won't let you!
Lightning's pragmatism, Fang's devotion, Snow's upbeat resilience, Saz's fatherly maturity, Vanille's upbeat perseverance, and Hope's, well, that one's in the name. There's a series of short stories collected into the book Final Fantasy XIII, Episode 0 Promise. Now, usually I wouldn't admit supplemental material like this into my analysis of a game, but the collection was published just a week after the game came out in Japan, so I will accept it into evidence this time. It basically depicts events before the start of the game we don't get to see. One of the chapters, from Saz's perspective, reveals he witnessed Snow trying to save Sarah from the authorities in this big cutscene presented in the game, which inspires him to hop on the Purge train. Funny to think Lightning's first companion on the journey is here because of the would-be brother-in-law she hates so much. The book has a few extra pieces of context, some of more note than others. The major focus of the book is giving more background to Vanille and Fang. We get a bit more about their time on Pulse hundreds of years ago, and the reality that their communal society down there wasn't exactly all friendship as magic either, with a less bureaucratic yet more ritualistic approach to the conflict. However, the book did let me down in that it still gives no explanation as to why Hope carries a big boomerang with him all the time, even before the events of the game kick off. The gamers might never know. Hope's pursuit of Snow culminates with Snow being grilled on his laissez-faire attitude, and on what you're supposed to do when losing someone who chose to be at your side, that you encouraged.
What happens when your actions end up ruining someone's life?
When someone's dead, when someone's gone, words are useless.
So that's it? People die and you just run away?
I know!
You're running from what you deserve!
Why don't you tell me what I deserve?
The same fate!
And as a barrage of missiles threatens to interrupt their confrontation, the answer becomes clear.
Get him home. Please.
You carry out the Fallen's wishes for them. The pieces are all in place for a series of excellent character moments like this, but in some the execution is better than others. Free will is a big theme in this game. One could argue it's the core theme. Humans are forced into servitude by the fal'Cie to participate in their conflict, but in turn, the godlike fal'Cie are also limited by function, by nature obligated to carry out only their intended job. One of them supplies the humans of Cocoon with food. That's its designated task and the only one it can carry out. And when Lightning crosses paths with it, dutifully carrying out its purpose with no alternative, she questions her own attitude of following instinct blindly without thinking.
I didn't want to think. So I fought instead. As long as I was fighting, nothing else was real.
Is instinct something we humans can be a slave to as well? Interesting questions for the strong-willed Lightning to ask herself as she realizes she needs to stop and think about how to act instead of just resolving to go in guns blazing. Unfortunately, the game has her come to this realization while walking a catwalk in a factory. I suppose in life dramatic revelations can come at any time, but otherwise when the game is so committed to presenting emotional shifts in the most dramatic way possible, the framing feels a bit awkward and out of place. Saz's breakdown is of course one of the hardest moments in the game.
Come back!
His son turns to Crystal after completing his focus, which on the face of it appears to have been finding Pulse l'Cie like his father and Vanille. The thought of that being it for his son, as well as Vanille being partly responsible for it all happening, a Cocoon fal'Cie having branded Dash to protect itself from Vanille, it drives him to the edge, triggering his summon to attack them to test his resolve. Despite his mixed feelings towards her, he still stands up for Vanille when it threatens them both.
Okay, fine. You want me? Come and get me!
After fighting it off though, the hopelessness returns, and I suppose we're supposed to view his decision to stand up to the summon not as a show of personal resolve, but out of care for his friend. I want to like this sequence just a bit more than I do. There's some amazing imagery, and you really feel for Saz at points as he decides to fight his summon, despite spiraling out. But there's a few pieces of this puzzle that I think undermine the overall intent. I can rationalize the back and forth of Saz pointing a gun at Vanille and then helping Vanille and then pointing his gun at her again straight after as the erratic behavior of a grieving man who has probably hated Pulse Lassie his whole life. Though it does feel like they just wanted the image of Saz turning the weapon from Vanille onto himself, even if it stretches some credulity given events moments ago. Getting the little Saz jumping in his car summon animation all giddy after he subdues it,
That's right. Let's do it.
right before reverting back to all hope is lost, is a bit much. Despite the what happens in the battle dimension stays in the battle dimension suspension of disbelief you're supposed to have while engaging with the game as a whole. I also don't need the hour-long fake-out that Saz may be dead. I don't see what it adds. The gameplay during this stretch is so business as usual with the other gang that I doubt I was supposed to be on the edge of my seat that entire hour before the reveal he's still alive, wondering if he was really gone, which makes the fake-out feel more pointless. Everything comes to a head when the team collide with Bartandalus, the ruler of Cocoon, who reveals he's also a fal'Cie and explains the truth of the war between Cocoon and Pulse. The war between the fal'Cie of Cocoon and those of Pulse is actually all in service of one goal: to destroy Cocoon and the people in it as a sacrifice to summon the fal'Cie's creator, the god of gods.
Bartandalus is crafting you into the instruments of Cocoon's demise. Why? To restore the Maker, the entity responsible for creating both humans and fal'Cie.
Cocoon is actually a paradise for humans, meant to grow their society to plump them up, so that the fal'Cie can kill them all and bring back Dad from his galactic sig run. The fal'Cie have it in their heads that humans have besmirched the world by being all rowdy and war-hungry, and a reset is what is needed, even if it means circumventing their program, and ironically stoking the flames of war further. This war of prejudice and paranoia is just a big front for the desires of the powers that be. Shocker, I know, when does that ever happen? Centuries ago, this was almost pulled off when Fang and Vanille were made Pulse Lassie by the leaders on Pulse and nearly crashed Cocoon. And now the latest new crop of Lassie, Lightning, Saz, Snow, and Hope, with the reawakened Vanille and Fang, are a new attempt to finish the job. Lassie charged with destroying Cocoon and performing the sacrifice. One would have to assume Sarah's role as a Pulse fal'Cie was to bring those people together as she became a crystal at the point they converged.
Her focus required that you be brought together. That girl did nothing but assemble the tools for Cocoon's destruction.
The twist that a complex geopolitical situation is actually a front for some big players to trigger the apocalypse is not really surprising. What I like is how this larger story device lets the game explore those themes of free will. The fal'Cie are bound by their programming and work around it by having humans carry out their plans outside of said programming. The humans are then caught in their own shackles, whether it be the more literal ones placed on the Lassie to make them complete their focus, or the invisible ones everyone in the society the fal'Cie construct wears as they're manipulated by those in charge, to hate the other and protect their little slice of paradise at any cost. fal'Cie, Lassie, God, human, everyone is placed in a little box of limited options, and the game is all about the struggle to overcome those limitations and what the cost might be. From the small interpersonal conflicts to the grand, big decisions that will constitute the climax. Sid Raines, a member of a Cocoon security force, secretly working to undermine Bartandalus' rule, helps our heroes. But even that is revealed to be part of a controlled opposition by Bartandalus. He's another Cocoon Lassie, charged by Barty to help the party survive and grow stronger.
I did my best to assist you, as bid by the Sanctum fal'Cie.
As a roundabout means to destroy Cocoon without undermining his programming. But inspired by the party's fight to break away from their focus of destroying Cocoon, he breaks his own focus and attacks the team to stop them from becoming said destroyers of Cocoon.
Seeing you fight brought it all back. I, too, will challenge my fate.
If he had beaten them, he would have become a zombie, failing to help them become stronger. But as a result of losing to them, he turns to Crystal. He technically completes his focus of helping them grow stronger by throwing a tough fight at them that they do manage to overcome and learn from. I like the l'Cie rock-and-a-hard-place dilemma because it keeps you guessing as to what decision characters are going to make, even if all the terms and rules can take a moment to get to grips with. But it's a long game, so it's not like you don't have time to mull it all over. The characters, unsure of what to do, also decide to mull it over by descending to Pulse in the hopes of finding a way to get rid of their l'Cie shackles. This is where you get a bit of an open area to explore at your own pace and complete certain side battles, though the way they're presented to you is a bit inorganic. Glowing markers on a map lead you to a text box that sends you to another marker to fight a monster. Add it to the checklist. But after 20 plus hours of one objective, I suppose it would be hard to communicate to players that they're allowed to explore now without doing it bluntly. Whether or not you think the first half being so restrictive was too much or not, this very stark contrast between the gameplay of Cocoon and Pulse does paint a picture. Linear gameplay in Cocoon under the watchful eye of the authorities in a restrictive society versus the untamed and unsanitized world of Pulse below that you're free to look around. One optional quest involves helping out some big chicken guys you may have heard of so that they'll let you move around the place faster and find secret items. It's an opportunity for Saz and Fang to interact in a scene, two characters who haven't got much of a shot at doing so up till now.
You don't have to begin anywhere. What happened to Dodge? Wasn't your fault.
But Saz...
You got more than enough weight on your shoulders already.
Other pivotal moments in character development happen. Hope is able to reflect on how the adventure has snapped him out of maybe some complacency he had.
When I was on Cocoon, I never dreamed a place like this could even exist. But now, here I am.
And he's finally able to joke around a bit. Most importantly, seeing Lightning and Snow finally find some common ground is satisfying. It's not a stretch to assume at this point that Snow's actions throughout the game have convinced her he's not just talk, and she's accepted he is intensely devoted to Sarah. But perhaps, more surprisingly, she realizes that the bravado and upbeat naivety she once hated in Snow has in fact helped her keep going too. She accepts that truth, finally, in her own brash way.
Hey!
Once we're home, what's your plan? You're getting married, right?
What's also of note is that finally getting some acceptance from Lightning allows Snow for a moment to ask for some reassurance from her. Allows him to show a sliver of self-doubt to someone.
You will see her, right?
Don't go there.
Lightning didn't want to be family with Snow, but families rely on each other. So over the course of the game, that's happened whether she wanted to or not. The Pulse segment does bottleneck into a long linear level involving a big tower, and this feels like one of the most unnecessary parts of the game. It's exhausting at this point to be thrown into some long time-wasting ancient temple trial, and it undermines the juxtaposition Pulse's open nature is supposed to present with Cocoon's linear levels. Fang and Vanille's deserted village is fine though, and does contrast in setting with Cocoon nicely, even if it is another linear segment. Bartandalus turns out to have a trump card. If the team aren't going to return to destroy Cocoon, he's going to orchestrate it another way by stoking the fires of the insurrectionist movement he had put his undercover l'Cie Cid in charge of. At the center of Cocoon there is a fal'Cie called Orphan that basically has the power that keeps Cocoon afloat. He implies that if Orphan is destroyed, say in a big civil war, then that will destroy Cocoon, with or without the party being coerced into doing it. He's also going to throw a few monsters into the mix, just to make sure the chaos and destruction is absolute. One might wonder why he needed to orchestrate the party becoming powerful l'Cie at all, if he could just create a civil war to destroy Cocoon. Maybe now had become the only moment where a civil war was possible after years of authoritarian rule, and just after a brutal attempt to purge some of the population. Though perhaps the reason he tells the party about the Civil War Plan B is just to lure them back to Cocoon to keep Plan A, the party destroying Cocoon, in play.
But what of yourselves? Will you enjoy the festivities beside me?
It's entirely possible he doesn't believe the chaos of the Civil War is enough to kill Orphan and end Cocoon, and he's merely presenting it as a possibility to get the team into the same room with Orphan. Whatever the case, the party decide to head back to prevent any loss of life possible. I like a villain with a complex plan that forces the heroes to have to make difficult choices, but I will say that while the protagonists in this game are quite nuanced and compelling, the villains as characters are a bit weak. Their motivations marry well with the themes of the story, but they are a bit one note. Sid is the one antagonist that keeps you guessing the most, but he's not in the game enough for it to capitalize on that. Especially thin is the Commander Lady, loyal to Barty, and just not a lot else going on for one of the few villains in a 60-hour RPG game. She doesn't even get to be in a real boss fight like at least Commander Guy does. Enemy design is a bit all over the map in this game. I like the complex, mechanized creatures the best. I think the overall metallic look of a lot of the otherworldly creatures in this title, including the player summons, is trying to allude to that theme of free will. Automatons designed for one purpose, trying to subvert their programming, like the leads themselves trying to subvert their focus. That said, a lot of the enemy designs go for this higgledy-piggledy look. Big bird insect guys and giant avant-garde light fixtures aren't very memorable bosses, and the game is replete with them. They take the place of boss spots that probably should have been filled in by an interesting roster of rivals or villain characters that the game, for some reason, for as long as it is, just doesn't have. The team engages in a spectacular re-entry into Cocoon on the backs of their summons in the middle of a sporting event, the army deploying to stop them in the midst of the chaos. In this scene, we get one of my favorite moments in the game. Snow saves a racer spiraling out and waves to the crowd triumphantly, forgetting to cover his l'Cie branding that marks him as a scary magic man and enemy of Cocoon. But he just doesn't care.
Probably should have covered that.
Snow doesn't even think to cover up who he is and not express his individuality and confidence. And when that backfires on him, he barely cares. He's like, oops, oh well, I love it so much. The climax begins when the team chase down Bartandalus, only to take him out and discover they've been lured into Orphan's chamber, when the defeated Bart merges with it, apparently being one with the thing that needs to be destroyed for his plan to be carried out isn't a big deal for him, since he's banking on his creator resetting the world.
All our sins absolved, and the world born anew.
No idea if this would actually happen if his creator returned. I think he's just high on his own supply, to be honest. Orphan/Bartandalus attempts to coerce Fang into becoming Ragnarok.
Ragnarok is the beast one of you must become.
A magical creature of immense power one can assume a strong enough l'Cie can become. Fang did become it centuries ago to split open Cocoon, when her and Vanille were tasked with destroying it. Orphan wants Fang as Ragnarok to destroy itself, and it attempts to make her do so by threatening Vanille and presenting the consequences of Fang not completing the pair's task, which would include Vanille transforming into a zombie. This happens to the rest of the team as they try to hold Fang back from doing her focus. While she does begin the process of trying to kill Orphan, she's flooded with thoughts of the times the rest of her friends chose not to take the violent approach, and she relents. The rest of the party re-emerge unzombified to save Vanille and Fang from Orphan's continued torment. Now, how did they become human again? Did the party become zombies and revert back through willpower or something? It's not made entirely clear, but the explanation I like best is proposed by Lightning.
We're alive! But you can't be. Could be more fal'Cie smoke and mirrors.
Perhaps this was an illusion created by Bartandalus to spur on Fang by showing her what Vanille could become if Cocoon isn't destroyed. After all, Bart already created an illusion of Sarah and Daj before the battle began to anger the team. Even though I think this is the answer the game supports the most, I admit it would match my personal preference, since I prefer it to the idea that just willpower and spirit alone, or something like that, got them out of such a serious threat that had been hanging over them the whole game. The gang then assert their free will in epic style and throw down one last time with Orphan.
We live to make the impossible possible. That is our focus.
Is it somewhat contrived, the villains of the game, the godlike fal'Cie, are coded to be unable to disobey their programming?
We fal'Cie are crafted for a single purpose. Through you.
We obtained freedom from our bondage.
You could argue that, but I think the point, again, is that humans aren't really that different. But with enough perseverance and ingenuity, maybe we can be. Orphan defeated, Cocoon begins to fall, and one of my favorite moments in the game happens. The main Cocoon 4 reach out their hands to each other as they fall.
Stay together!
Hey, grab my hand.
Okay!
It's entirely possible they had some plan they were going to enact by doing this before Vanille and Fang stepped into action a second later. But nevertheless, there's something that feels so human about this moment. The act of holding hands as they fall to an uncertain fate, alongside people of such different stripes, says more about the bond they've developed than words can at this point. Fang and Vanille combine to become Ragnarok, and push their way down to the bottom of Cocoon to produce a huge concoction of the elements, lava and ice. With Cocoon falling, their task is complete, turning them to crystal. But by flinging themselves under Cocoon alongside the hell they kick up, the crystal they turn into conducts itself throughout all the water and fire, becoming this massive pillar holding Cocoon up, and preventing it from crashing with all the people inside. That crystal transformation that awaits the successful l'Cie, the shackles that have loomed over our characters the whole game, are then brandished against their would-be masters, ending up being the tool that prevents the fal'Cie from getting what they want. What's implied to be the gate to the heavens closes. No sacrifices received. The others turn to Crystal too, their focus complete as well, thanks to being instrumental in causing Cocoon to fall. But after a moment, they're released, alongside Sarah and Daj. I see this as the heroes triggering a kind of short circuit.
My brand! It's gone!
They complete their focus by making Cocoon crash, but then stop it with a temporary pillar. They have guaranteed Cocoon will be destroyed, but this will happen at a point after there's been plenty of time for everyone on there to emigrate off it. The team have achieved a weird middle ground that their magic l'Cie programming can't quite figure out.
Does this mean we completed our focus?
Cocoon's seen better days, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I'd say that qualifies as a demolition. Focus complete.
Cocoon is both destroyed and not destroyed at the same time, releasing the characters from their l'Cie curse. I like this ending a lot. In a game all about characters trying to find a solution to an impossible problem, I'm glad that it wasn't just Brawn or Will, although of course they played a part, or some dual spell that got them out of their predicament. I like how it was by exploiting a technicality in a smart way that they managed to get away with it. In a world where gods and humans fight a war by exploiting loopholes, humanity turn out to be the ultimate loophole experts. What's also affecting is that this wasn't achieved without sacrifice, with Vanille and Fang taking the fall for our heroes and the entirety of Cocoon. How come Vanille and Fang remain crystallized when the others don't? Well, they received a different focus hundreds of years ago from the other four, so maybe their transformation operates differently, or maybe somehow they're choosing to stay that way. Sid showed us that some amount of will can affect the transformation. In his boss fight, he's in this weird limbo of both carrying out his focus and doing the opposite at the same time. He's helping the team while trying to end them, and his design in that moment seems to reflect that. The claws of the zombie fail state combined with the sheen of crystal success. Either way, on some level this was a conscious sacrifice by Fang and Vanille, and it's a very poignant one. They were the last two members of a race of people who were locked into war with the race they sacrificed themselves to save.
Yeah, back then we never would have helped you guys.
The last act of the two last people of Pulse is to save Cocoon, defying the cycle of violence and making a mockery of the prejudice and manipulation that sparked the conflict. But to contrast with these grand themes of war and peace, we end on an interpersonal human moment, the kind that make all these larger world-ending conflicts worth struggling through to begin with.
We got a wedding to plan!
The final line of the game is Lightning congratulating Sarah and Snow on their engagement.
Congrats.
It comes off like one final flagrant display of free will, framing the war and gods they put behind them as mere detours on the journey to resolving a personal human conflict. It's an empowering gesture for the characters to go out on, swatting the powers that be aside like they're nothing, compared to resolving something personal. FF13 can be incredibly verbose, so it's a surprise when the last 5 minutes really play out without much exposition to explain what's going on, so that the emotion, action, and catharsis can be delivered without too much interruption. You may have to do some piecing together of what just happened yourself, but I think it's worth it for how spectacular the ending ends up. It's one of my favorite last few moments of a game ever as a result. Like other Final Fantasy games, some elements aren't entirely explained and left up to the player to make up their own mind about, which I don't consider a bad thing. You could argue different reasons why the l'Cie brands are white at different points in the game instead of their default black, but the reading I like to go with is that it ties into the l'Cie's intention. Fang's brand is white after she gets amnesia and forgets what her focus was, and the team's brands become white after they triumphantly choose to create their own focus and forget the one forced on them. I am aware that FF13 has 2 sequels. I haven't played them, maybe I will someday. I don't have any plans to do it anytime soon, it's not really a priority for me. I especially wanted to make this video before I ever play them, to crystallize my interpretation and feelings on the story without those future materials hanging over them. Possible later retcons and clarifications aside, I think what I laid out here is what you can interpret from FF13-1 as a standalone work, and that's how I'm choosing to judge it. It works really well as one. Sure, it's probably about 15 hours longer than it needed to be, and despite usually having amazing presentation, not every moment gets the execution it perhaps should have warranted. But there's something about this journey I really resonate with. It stirs a weird feeling in me, how the game mixes a sense of tragedy with such a vibrant, colorful world. How the title will often merge intense feelings of pain with beauty. Maybe there's beauty in pain because we find our strength in it. And this team having to find that strength from one of the most hopeless starting positions they could have been put in here is often very gripping. Most Final Fantasies put the team effort at the center of the story, but FF13 does so even more than a lot of the others. That will still often veer off to focus on a central hero's personal rivalry with the main bad guy. Here, from beginning to end, the focus is placed solely on the team as a unit. Everyone as important as each other as they stand up together. Their fragility when apart is made a point of, and the game never wavers from that point. And yet there's still a fun energy to the game that comes through via the stylish characters, wild powers, and mad fantasy world that never settles for generic tropes when a fresh design can take their place. I think that's hard to deny. I think it's crystal clear. And it looks even clearer years later, now that we're 2 more original single-player FF games down the line. Final Fantasy XV took an opposite approach to 13, being set almost entirely in an open world with one-to-one character control in combat. It's worth pointing out that 15 had originally intended to release in the same window as 13, under the name Versus 13, but ended up releasing a whole 6 years later, and even then the game feels weirdly paced and unfinished in a way that 13 doesn't. Not to say that 13 is an extremely feature-rich game or anything, but within the parameters of what it's doing, what needs to be there is there. While certain pivotal areas or moments in 15 feel rushed or undercooked relative to the scope of the game as a whole, with DLC having to be released well after the fact to patch up some of the holes. You end up questioning whether that open structure was worth it given the result, but its approach to characters is also questionable. Taking the reverse approach again to 13, the game starts with you and a team who all already know each other and are already on great terms, sharing inoffensive banter with each other. You can spend a lot of the game hanging out with them and doing little holiday-type activities, but because the relationships were already established, it felt like I was on the outside looking in. Maybe looking in is enough for you if the characters are handsome enough, but to me there was a lack of character to get invested in. The group momentarily falling out at the third act wasn't going to change that. Nothing symbolizes the different approach more to me than how in 13, the emotional licensed song about love and friendship plays in the last cutscene when those feelings have climaxed, whereas in 15 it plays right at the very beginning. For a game that also was so keen to underline this team dynamic, unlike 13, which stayed laser focused on that dynamic, 15 shifting so much of the climax towards focusing on a 1v1 rivalry with an eccentric villain and a very rarely present love interest also didn't make much sense to me in this specific case. 16 continued evolving in this direction, mechanically uninterested in a group dynamic, and wavering, uncertain about committing to it story-wise. It was quite squarely about a single superpowered guy whose supporting cast on the periphery are so inoffensive and constantly supportive, they start leaving your memory pretty quickly after it's all over. 13 is a little more risky by having the characters make a lot of questionable calls early on, and having them not necessarily put their best foot forward with the audience, but it makes where they all end up at the end a lot more satisfying and impactful. Whether either of these two newer games' stories works for you, I think it's easier to agree on the fact that Final Fantasy has been trying to take itself a bit too seriously at the cost of creativity and fun. After 13, we haven't had, say, a guy who summons two babes to transform into a bike he can do burnouts on the monsters with, or dual-wielding, improvising gun-fu man with a bird who lives in his hair fusing his two guns together, or teenage girl riding a mech telling it to shoot by doing finger guns. I don't think 15 or 16 were necessarily bad games, but I think we'd gain a lot at this stage trying to bring back some of 13's spirit to this series, because it feels like the last time the franchise was a truly unique and memorable force all its own in the big budget gaming space. And you know what? At this point, it released quite a long time ago.